sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Hi everyone.
Today we're looking into some really serious allegations against Sean Diddy Combs.
Yeah.
Probably as a music mogul.
Yeah.
But these allegations go way beyond music. We're talking accusations of sexual assault brought by a woman named Ashley Parham.
Right.
And our main source for this deep dive is going to be a recent article from the New York Post.
Yeah. And it's a crazy story.
Oh, it's a wild one. So let's get right into it.
What's so interesting here is that you've got these two completely opposing narratives.
Right.
It's not just a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
It's a he said, she said with really serious consequences for both sides.
Right. So Ashley Parham's claims are shocking, to say the least.
Yeah.
She alleges that Combs, along with 3 other men, raped her back in 2018 at a house in California. And she goes into graphic detail. She's accusing Combs of anal rape. She even claims that his former chief of staff, Christina Coram, tried to insert a copper IUD into her.
And if that wasn't disturbing enough,
Right.
she also alleges that Combs assaulted her with a TV remote. That's a really disturbing picture she paints.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, what could have led to such an escalation?
Well, according to Parham, it was a comment she made about Combs being responsible for Tupac Shakur's murder.
Oh, wow. That's a loaded accusation.
Yeah.
Especially in that context.
Especially in that context.
I can imagine how things could get heated really quickly.
You can imagine. And it's important to note that blaming someone for Tupac's murder is a very serious thing.
Absolutely.
This isn't just a casual insult. This carries a lot of weight. It could easily provoke a strong reaction.
Yeah, you would think.
And the alleged reaction in this case is pretty terrifying. Parham claims that Combs even fired a gun at her, forcing her to escape to a neighbor's house.
Wow.
But then here's where it gets even more confusing. She went back to the house later. The interviewer, Ashley Banfield, even questioned this decision.
Yeah.
And honestly, I can see why.
The return to the scene is definitely a point that raises eyebrows.
Yeah.
It seems counterintuitive given the trauma she describes.
Right.
But remember,
Yeah.
people respond to trauma in different ways.
Yeah.
And sometimes their actions might not make sense to those who haven't experienced such a horrific event.
Okay, that's a good point. We can't assume we know how someone would react in that situation. But there's another detail that really stuck with me. The knife incident. Parham claims she hit Combs and even considered stabbing him with a knife. She described it as a kill or be killed moment.
Wow.
But ultimately says her moral compass stopped her.
That's a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
It speaks to the level of fear and desperation she must have felt in that moment. It also highlights the fact that we're dealing with accusations of violence on both sides.
So we have Parham's side of the story, which is undeniably harrowing. But what about Combs? How does he respond to these accusations?
All through his legal team, Combs has vehemently denied everything. They call Parham's claims completely unfounded and point to the fact that the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department investigated the allegations and concluded they were baseless.
They're not just saying she's wrong. They're claiming they have proof. Combs' lawyers say they have documents that show he wasn't even in Orinda, California on the day of the alleged assault.
Interesting.
They also argue there's no evidence placing him in the same room as Parham, and that her entire story is simply not believable.
So it's a bold strategy.
Yeah.
And it definitely adds another layer of complexity to this already convoluted situation.
Right.
We have 2 completely contradictory accounts, and it's up to us to try and make sense of it all.
So you've heard Ashley Parham's side of the story, and you've heard Diddy's response, but there's another layer here that adds to the confusion. Parham's lawyer claims the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department has a history of dismissing accusations from survivors.
That's interesting.
If that's true, it makes you wonder how much weight we can give their unfounded conclusion.
Yeah, that's a valid point. You might be wondering, how can the police conclude a case is unfounded?
Right.
What does that even mean?
Exactly.
It's important to understand that when the police say the case is unfounded, it doesn't necessarily mean they believe Diddy. It just means they didn't find enough evidence to file charges. Think of it like
a puzzle where you just don't have enough pieces to complete the picture.
Exactly.
Okay.
In this case, we might never have all the pieces.
This whole story, it's like a puzzle with missing pieces, but we're going to try to put those pieces together, right?
Right. And that starts with understanding the key elements of this case. Let's unpack what unfounded really means in this context. When a police investigation concludes that an allegation is unfounded, it signifies that based on their investigation, there is no credible evidence to support the claim. This doesn't necessarily equate to innocence, but it does mean that from a legal perspective, they haven't found sufficient grounds to proceed with charges.
Okay, so it's not a declaration of innocence, but rather an indication that they don't have enough to go on. So what does that mean for Diddy and Parham? What are the implications for both sides?
Well, for Diddy, the unfounded conclusion is a significant victory.
Okay.
It provides him with a basis to deny the allegations and potentially defend his reputation. However, it's crucial to remember that the absence of charges doesn't erase the accusations or the impact they've had on his public image. He still faces the court of public opinion, and that can be just as challenging to navigate as any legal battle.
I see your point, but I'm still stuck on the fact that she went back to the house. That seems hard to reconcile with her claims.
That's a valid point. It's a detail that warrants further scrutiny and raises questions about the sequence of events. Why would someone who experienced such trauma return to the alleged scene? It's a question that perhaps only Parham can answer, but it underscores the complexities of trauma and the various ways individuals cope with such experiences.
And we have to factor in what Parham's lawyer is claiming about the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department.
Right.
If they do have a pattern of dismissing accusations from survivors, it casts a shadow over their investigation.
Absolutely. If true, it suggests a potential systemic issue that could have impacted how Parham's case was handled.
Right.
This adds another layer of complexity to the narrative as it raises questions about the thoroughness and impartiality of the investigation itself.
This detail about the gun is terrifying on its own, but it also raises questions about why Parham went back to the house. It seems like every detail in this story has a counter-narrative.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what makes this case so challenging. It's a web of conflicting accounts, each with its own set of complexities and potential biases. We're left with more questions than answers, and it's up to us to try and untangle this web as best we can.
So how do we even begin to make sense of this? Where do we go from here? We've got Parham claiming a horrifying ordeal, Combs flatly denying it, and a police investigation that yielded no charges. What should we, as informed listeners, be thinking about?
I think the first step is acknowledging that there might not be a clear-cut answer here. We're dealing with a situation where the truth is likely murky and nuanced. It's not about picking sides. It's about recognizing the complexities and understanding that we might never have a complete picture of what truly transpired.
You're right. It's easy to fall into the trap of wanting a definitive answer, a guilty or not guilty verdict. But life is rarely that simple, especially when it comes to cases like this.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking becomes so important. We need to move beyond simply absorbing information and start actively analyzing it. Ask yourself, what are the potential biases at play here? What motivates each party involved? Are there any inconsistencies in their accounts?
So you're saying we need to be like detectives?
Yes.
Examining the evidence and looking for clues.
Exactly.
That might help us understand the bigger picture.
Precisely. For instance, let's look at the police investigation. The fact that no charges were filed doesn't automatically mean Combs is innocent, right?
You're saying a lack of charges doesn't equal innocence, but it also doesn't equal guilt.
Exactly. It simply means the authorities didn't find enough evidence to move forward with a prosecution at that time.
So does that mean the investigation was flawed? Or that Parham's claims are false?
Not necessarily. There are many reasons why a case might not lead to charges even if the allegations are true. Sometimes evidence is lost or mishandled. Sometimes witnesses are afraid to come forward. And sometimes, as Parham's lawyer suggests, there are systemic issues within law enforcement that prevent cases from being properly investigated.
Okay, so we have to consider the possibility that even if Parham is telling the truth, the system might have failed her. But then how do we reconcile that with Combs' alibi and his team's insistence that her story is a fabrication?
Well, that's where things get really tricky. We have to weigh the credibility of both sides, taking into account any potential motives or inconsistencies.
For example, Combs is a powerful and wealthy figure. Could that have influenced the investigation in any way?
It's a valid question. Power dynamics often play a role in these kinds of cases. It's not about accusing anyone of wrongdoing. But it's important to acknowledge that those in positions of power sometimes have an advantage when it comes to legal matters.
On the other hand, Parham waited several years to come forward with these accusations. Could there be an ulterior motive there?
That's another question we have to grapple with. There are many reasons why a survivor might delay reporting an assault. Fear, shame, and the potential for retaliation are all very real factors. But it's also fair to consider whether there might be other motivations at play.
So it sounds like we're stuck in this gray area where there are no easy answers. It's frustrating, to be honest. I want to believe survivors, but I also want to be fair to everyone involved. How do we navigate this uncertainty?
I think the first step is accepting that uncertainty. We might never know for sure what happened that night. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from this case and use it as an opportunity to examine our own beliefs and biases.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the drama and take sides. But maybe the real value lies in using this case as a springboard for deeper reflection.
Exactly. This case isn't just about Diddy and Ashley Parham. It's about the larger societal issues of power privilege and the challenges of seeking justice in a system that isn't always equitable.
So instead of trying to reach a definitive conclusion, maybe the goal should be to engage in thoughtful dialogue. Ask critical questions. And challenge our own assumptions.
I couldn't agree more. It's about acknowledging that there are multiple truths, multiple perspectives, and that the journey toward understanding is often more important than reaching a final destination.
You know, you mentioned earlier that we need to be like detectives. But it's more than just gathering evidence, isn't it? It's also about understanding the context, the societal forces at play, and the way those forces might influence our perceptions.
Absolutely. For example, think about the media coverage of this case. How has the story been framed? Are both sides being represented fairly? Or is there a particular narrative being pushed?
That's a great point. It's so easy to be swayed by the way a story is presented. We need to be critical consumers of information, especially when dealing with sensitive and complex issues like sexual assault allegations.
And that requires us to be aware of our own biases, both conscious and unconscious. How do our personal experiences, beliefs, and values shape the way we interpret information?
You know, you're making me realize that this deep dive isn't just about Diddy and Parham. It's about all of us. It's about how we as individuals and as a society respond to these kinds of accusations.
Exactly. It's a reflection of our cultural values, our legal system, and our understanding of justice.
It's about so much more than just one case.
It is. It's about the ongoing conversation we need to have about sexual assault, power dynamics, and the challenges of achieving true justice.
And that conversation can be uncomfortable, messy, and at times deeply frustrating.
Absolutely. But it's a conversation we can't afford to shy away from.
Imagine you're on the jury in this case. What evidence would you need to see to be convinced of either side's story? I know I'm having trouble deciding what to believe.
It's a tough question to answer, isn't it? Because even if we had access to all the evidence, there's still the human element to consider. How do we assess the credibility of witnesses? How do we account for the emotional impact of trauma?
It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit together.
And that's the nature of these kinds of cases. They rarely offer clear-cut solutions.
So if we can't expect a neat and tidy ending, what's the point of even trying to understand this case?
Because even in the absence of definitive answers, there are valuable lessons to be learned. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power dynamics, the complexities of sexual assault allegations, and the challenges of seeking justice in a system that isn't always equitable. It's a call to action for all of us to become more informed, more engaged, and more willing to challenge our own assumptions.
I like that. It's not about finding a solution to this particular case. It's about using it as a catalyst for personal growth and societal change.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this incredibly complex and unsettling case, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah. What should our listeners take away from all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this case, like so many others involving accusations of sexual assault, doesn't have a neat and tidy resolution. We're left with this sense of unease, knowing that someone's truth is being denied. But we don't know for sure whose.
It's definitely a heavy feeling. It makes you realize how difficult these situations are to navigate, both for the individuals involved and for the public trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to resist the urge to jump to conclusions. We need to acknowledge the seriousness of the accusations, recognize the potential for harm on both sides, and respect the importance of due process.
You mentioned due process earlier. Can you explain what that means in this context, especially since there aren't any charges filed?
Sure. Due process is a fundamental legal principle that ensures fairness and protects the rights of all parties involved in a legal proceeding. It guarantees things like the right to a fair hearing, the right to be represented by an attorney, and the right to confront one's accusers. In this case, even though no charges have been filed, the principle of due process still applies.
So even in the court of public opinion, we have a responsibility to ensure fairness and avoid rushing to judgment.
Precisely. It's about respecting the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. And recognizing that accusations alone do not equate to guilt. We need to be cautious about forming definitive opinions based solely on allegations, no matter how compelling they may seem.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of a story, but it's crucial to remember that there are real people involved with real lives that are deeply impacted by these accusations.
Absolutely. This case serves as a stark reminder of the complexities involved in addressing sexual assault allegations. It highlights the challenges faced by survivors in coming forward, the difficulties in proving these types of cases, and the potential for damage to reputations on both sides.
So what can we as individuals do to contribute to a more just and informed approach to these kinds of situations?
I think it starts with education. We need to educate ourselves about the complexities of sexual assault, the legal processes involved, and the impact of trauma on survivors. This knowledge can help us engage in more nuanced conversations and avoid perpetuating harmful stereotypes or biases.
So it's about moving beyond the headlines and seeking a deeper understanding of the issues at play.
Exactly. It's also about being mindful of the language we use and avoiding language that blames or shames survivors. We need to create a culture where survivors feel safe to come forward and where their experiences are taken seriously.
And at the same time, we need to ensure fairness for all parties involved, recognizing that accusations alone do not equal guilt.
All right, it's a delicate balance to strike, and honestly, it's something we're still figuring out as a society.
It is a lot to think about. For our listeners who are still processing this information, what's one question you would encourage them to ponder?
Considering everything we've discussed, the conflicting accounts, the evidence presented, and the potential biases, I'd ask, what would it take for you to personally feel confident in forming a conclusion about this case? What factors would you consider most important in evaluating the credibility of each side?
That's a powerful question. It encourages us to move beyond passive consumption of information and actively engage in critical thinking. It reminds us that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing process, not a destination.
Exactly. It's about being willing to wrestle with the uncomfortable truths, to challenge our own assumptions, and to approach these complex issues with empathy, nuance, and a commitment to fairness.
Well said. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been intense, eye-opening, and honestly a little bit unsettling.
It has been a pleasure. And remember, listeners, knowledge is power, but only when we use it responsibly, critically, and with a genuine desire to understand the world around us.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till